That's really a statement of the way in which NATO is shifting east. At the moment, when I was there, you had RAF Eurofighter Typhoons. Some Finnish Typhoons had just left. So it's currently got one runway. They're expanding it to a second runway. There's a huge American presence, so you've got almost a car park of huge armored vehicles. Too many to count. It's already impressive, but it is growing in scale, and this is obviously causing consternation in Moscow. They see it as they're being on their doorstep. They see the Black Sea as their sphere of influence.
Well, George, first of all, I know you've just come back from your visit to what is going to be Europe's largest NATO airbase. Give us a sense of the scale of it.
That's right. So the MK airbase is in eastern Romania. It's only about 60 miles from the border with Ukraine. It's on the Black Sea. To give you a sense, it's in the vicinity of Crimea. That's about 250 miles away. So it's in a very contested part of the world. Now, traditionally, NATO has had its main air bases in Central Europe. You kind of think of where the Iron Curtain was. They tended to be, on the western side, so Western Germany, Italy, that line. But since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, they've moved east, and obviously that sort of process has been hastened by the invasion of Ukraine. And now Romania is building this airbase, MK airbase, and developing it into what will become the largest NATO military garrison anywhere in Europe. And that's really a statement of the way in which NATO is shifting east. At the moment, when I was there, you had RAF Eurofighter Typhoons. Some Finnish Typhoons had just left. So it's currently got one runway. They're expanding it to a second runway. There's a huge American presence, so you've got almost a car park of huge armored vehicles. Too many to count. It's already impressive, but it is growing in scale, and this is obviously causing consternation in Moscow. They see it as they're being on their doorstep. They see the Black Sea as their sphere of influence. So for NATO to develop Romania to build for NATO, it's the largest airbase in the whole of NATO. Right there, it is really a statement of intent.
And obviously air power seems very relevant at the moment because the first F-16s are now being delivered to Ukraine. Talk me through NATO's role when it comes to the F-16s. I mean, they are NATO supplied or supplied by NATO member states. And does NATO have any role in the training of the fighter pilots?
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind that Ukraine first asked for fighter jets basically as soon as Russia launched the invasion, because there was this disparity in terms of air power. Ukraine operated a few old Soviet jets, and they were basically able to keep the Russians at bay, but not much more than that. And as a result, every time you hear about drone and missile strikes and by now thousands of civilian casualties across Ukraine, that's directly tied to the fact that Ukraine has not been able to defend its airspace. So it's been an ask for a long time. NATO were initially reluctant to give those. There were a number of reasons for that. I mean, firstly, it was seen as potentially escalatory to give Ukraine such powerful weapons that could potentially be used to strike into Russia. We've seen over time those concerns fade, and basically Western countries actually sanctioning attacks using Western weapons on Russian territory. So that problem has gone. But there was also, the logistical questions. Flying a fighter jet is not a straightforward thing. You need an airbase of a certain size. You need to be able to protect that airbase with sufficient air defenses. You need to have the pilots who are trained on those jets. So it's not something that could be done overnight, as, for example, giving Ukraine artillery shells could be. So yeah, it was internationally brokered. I mean, the key country in all this was the US. They made the fighter jets. It would have to have their approval for them to be transferred from other countries' stocks. But then you started to see a number of countries who are upgrading to F-35s, which is the newest US fighter, basically have these spare planes. Belgium, Holland, Denmark, these were the countries that were kind of being looked at. And yeah, so finally, Zelensky was able to hold his press conference this weekend in front of fighter jets and declare, this moment of hope for Ukraine. Bear in mind the extent to which they'll affect the battlefield. Certainly, it makes Russia think twice, but Russia still has a vastly superior number of fighter jets. And bear in mind as well that the front line is huge. It's hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so protecting all along that length is going to be challenging when you, at the moment, only have a handful. That will obviously grow over time, and Ukraine is very reluctant to give exact numbers. But it's not necessarily going to be the silver bullet that means that this creeping Russian advance that we're seeing in Donbass and eastern Ukraine is reversed.
Yeah, operationally, how do you think they will be used? Will they largely be used to undermine Russian air defences?
I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, we have seen Russian fighter jets become bolder and bolder about approaching those front lines and releasing glide bombs from about 40, 50, 60 miles behind the front lines and allowing them to fall on Ukrainian positions. And so fighter jets is the only really way that you can push them back and force them to sort of be out of range, because you can use air-to-air missiles to fire from the air at other fighter jets that kind of approach the Russian fighter jets that approach the front line. So stopping those Russian planes from dropping glide bombs is an absolute priority. We've seen probably most clearly in the battle for Avdiivka earlier this year, when Russia concentrates its firepower and drops these huge, some of them are 1.5 tons. Most of them are half a ton, but massive bombs that not only destroy all cover that the Ukrainians have for defending, but they also, the blast radius is such that it gives Ukrainian soldiers concussion within a long way away from those bombs. So it has a kind of multiplying effect. Even if it's not direct casualties, it kind of takes a lot of people out of action quite quickly. And in Avdiivka, which is, a town basically, when they're dropping 80, 90 a day, that has a huge effect. So pushing those planes back and stopping the Russians using glide bombs in this kind of carpet bombing way is one thing. And yeah, if they can take out the Russian air defenses and therefore kind of expose Russian ammunition dumps and command headquarters and stuff that they were hitting at one point, but have since been successfully protected, or the Russians have got better at protecting them. That would obviously be another key target. But I think that those will be among the main things that they'd be aiming to do with those F-16.
And just finally, George, I know you say that Ukraine is almost deliberately vague about the numbers of F-16s it has at its disposal. I think Zelensky has said previously they would need around 130 F-16s to be able to undermine Russian aerial dominance. Is there any prospect of them getting that quantity of F-16s?
Not in the near future, no. That's a big number. I think he was photographed with 2 behind him on the ground, 2 in the air. It's something. Something is better than nothing. And like I say, it makes the Russians think twice, because at the moment the Russians, feel that they can approach the front lines with relative security. Yes, if they've lost a few fighter jets to Patriot air defenses, but given how many Russia has and Russia produces, they thought that was a risk worth running. The hope is, from the Ukrainian side, that even having a few adds to the arsenal, makes the Russians think again about those missions, that they become too risky for them to run, and that the cost benefit kind of analysis from the Russian Air Force tilts back, away from using Russian fighter jets to drop glide bombs, at short range, or indeed, if you have a missile and you get closer, then again you can improve the accuracy. So that's another reason why pushing them back is really important for Ukraine.